At the end of the last video, I spoke of how shadows and doubles swirl and multiply around Batman, himself an archetypal shadow figure. In this video, I'll examine Batman's origins, both his comic book origin and his real-world creation, through this archetypal lens. Some of the psychological mechanisms associated with the shadow were present, it seems, even before Batman himself arrived on the scene. Now, famously, he made his debut in Detective Comics 27. But the first issue of Detective Comics actually confronted us with a slightly different, though perhaps no less powerfully graphic image, in which the signifiers of racial difference have become, through savage caricature, signifiers of evil. This is a typical example of what is sometimes called yellow peril imagery, a phrase that I invite you to research further, and as such it also represents an act of pop cultural projection, in which the presumed righteousness of the Western white self is secured through the spectacular assertion of the wrongness of the orientalized other. This is where Batman ultimately finds his home. Other shadows of denial and projection swirl around the scandal over who actually created the character. The name that appeared in the byline was that of Bob Kane. And here's a picture of the man himself. Now, for years, Kane claimed that he alone invented Batman, even putting his name to a comic strip version of the story, created for a title called Real Fact Comics in 1946. This version of events opens with a portrait of Kane at his desk. Captions in the subsequent panels remind us of what a big-time success Batman is. Things quickly take a turn for the bizarre, however, when Kane invites a friend over one evening and asks him to put on a costume he claims his mother has made. As if this is a perfectly ordinary request to make of one's house guests of an evening, on par with asking them to take off their shoes at the door. Kane's comic book avatar is hilariously brusque about this when his friend has the temerity to ask why he should accede to Kane's slightly creepy request. "Just put it on, I'll explain later." It's not quite as bad as "it puts the costume on or it gets the hose," I suppose, but close enough for discomfort. It turns out that Kane's mother was a genius of a designer, for the costume, of course, is that of Batman. As Kane explains to his friend, "I'm sketching a new character, a creature of the night." Kane then sells the concept to DC. Note how careful he is to credit the company for expert editorial guidance in that final caption. And he then sets about creating a model replica of Gotham because he wants his comics to be based on scientific facts. On the following page, Kane gives himself further credit for coming up with all the most famous and copyrightable features of the Batman concept: the Batmobile, the utility belt, the Batcave, before being inspired to create Robin after a suggestion in one of his many fan letters. On the final page, in a slightly mean-spirited sequence, Kane also credits an unnamed friend, and we should probably put scare quotes around both credits and friend by this point, for giving him the idea of the Joker. The strip then ends with a truly self-aggrandizing final panel in which a tiny Batman and Robin thank their brilliant creator for bringing us to life. Now, not named anywhere in this account is Bill Finger, a man who did in fact once count Bob Kane among his friends. According to Bill, who was a former pulp writer, Bob was already working at DC Comics when he was assigned with the task of coming up with a concept to rival Superman by his editor, and he hit a creative roadblock. Bob had got as far as designing a red-garbed crime fighter with mechanical wings when he approached Bill for help. It was Bill who suggested that a character based on a nocturnal creature like a bat would look more effective in a darker costume. It was Bill who recommended replacing the wings with a scalloped cape. It was Bill who came up with the distinctive hooded and bat-eared cowl, and it was Bill who invented the Bruce Wayne identity, the Batmobile, the character of Robin, as well as writing the famous origin story. Kane revised his narrative on a few separate occasions, most decisively in this book, published 15 years after Bill Finger died, apparently without heirs, where Kane admitted that Bill had helped out quite a lot. "Now that my longtime friend and collaborator is gone, I must admit that Bill never received the fame and recognition he deserved. He was an unsung hero. I often tell my wife if I could go back 15 years before he died, I would like to say, I'll put your name on it now. You deserve it. But even as he belatedly acknowledged that his dead friend had played a central role in creating the Batman character, Kane further muddied the waters by pointing to other influences, citing this Da Vinci sketch of a flying machine as the inspiration for Batman's scout cape, for example, and also pointing towards numerous other Bat shadows and Bat doubles. These include Zorro, another masked man whose secret identity is that of a foppish aristocrat, and perhaps most intriguingly, a 1920s movie entitled The Bat. This movie was itself an archetypal shadow story in which a detective pursued a murderer called the Bat, only to discover in the last reel that he is the murderer himself. He thought he was fighting crime, but in fact he was just chasing his own demons, his own shadow all along. Now, Bill Finger was not the only collaborator that Kane denied due credit. He also disputed the claim of his young art assistant Jerry Robinson to have created Batman's most famous enemy. Kane claimed that the look of the character was inspired by an actor named Conrad Veidt. And that's not the Joker, that is Conrad Veidt, star of the German expressionist movie The Man Who Laughs. Although, for once, Kane was willing to give Bill Finger credit for showing him a picture of Veidt. But Jerry Robinson said that the character was his idea, and that he was inspired by an ordinary pack of playing cards, which is why a Joker card of his design appears in the first story featuring the character. Another of Kane's uncredited ghost artists, Sheldon Moldoff, makes Kane the villain of the story in a more literal way, saying that he thought the Joker bore a striking resemblance to Kane himself. As the shadows of scandal multiply, Batman's greatest nemesis starts to look like a shadow image of the somewhat shady character who first claimed to have created him. And if you want to know more about the real men behind the Batman myth, I highly recommend this documentary, currently streaming on Hulu. Great lockdown viewing and relevant background material for what will be our final module on Batman and authorship. Having explored some of the shadows behind Batman's creation, I now want to take a closer look at Batman's first comic book adventure and origin story. These are included in the PDF of early Batman comics that accompanies this module. So if you haven't taken a look at them yet, please pause the video here and do so now, and I'll see you again in a few minutes. Okay, if you've read the first Batman story from Detective Comics 27, you'll have seen that several key elements of the Batman mythos are established remarkably swiftly. Although it is amateurishly drawn, Kane was a poor draftsman who would rely entirely on ghosts once the series took off. The design concept of that first panel, with the familiar silhouetted bat-winged shape next to the title, has served as the basis for literally hundreds of Batman stories ever since. The second panel then introduces not only Bruce Wayne, but also his friend Commissioner Gordon, who remains an integral member of the supporting cast. The frightened reaction of the criminals at Batman's first appearance in costume a few pages later, and the subsequent fight sequence demonstrating the combat prowess of the hero, are also story beats that will be repeated in literally hundreds of Batman tales over the next 8 decades. The execution may be crude, but this first story nevertheless establishes several key elements of an astonishingly successful narrative formula that has proved endlessly recyclable. Another basic ingredient of that formula is hinted at in the title, The Case of the Chemical Syndicate, which evokes the conventions of detective fiction. The story proceeds as the title might lead us to expect. A mystery is announced early on and unraveled by the hero at the last moment. Now, final panels filled with explanatory prose like this are less common today. Again, it seems unsophisticated to us. But the hybrid generic mode, the mixing of superhero fantasy with the conventions of crime fiction, remains an essential aspect of the Batman blend and brand. In the course of the next few issues, other aspects of the Batman mythos are established with similar efficiency. For example, the cool gadgets, the Batcopter, the Batarang, the utility belt, and other versatile solutions for modern living were introduced in just the third Batman story, apparently written by yet another ghost assistant of Bob Kane's, a writer named Gardner Fox. The depiction of lethal violence was also quite common in these early tales. Here we see Batman euthanizing some criminals who have been turned into monsters. In the final panel, he sadly announces, "Much as I hate to take human life, I'm afraid this time it's necessary." And here he's shown happily torturing a suspect for information in a scene that could almost be right out of the Christopher Nolan movies. And of course, in Detective Comics 33, in just 2 masterfully economical pages, the origin was told in the familiar terms that again have lasted essentially unchanged through to the present. So this origin tale first appeared as the 2-page preface to a regular adventure, hence the incongruous dirigibles. Now when reprinted, the dirigibles are edited out, but this is how it first appeared. I want you to notice how much space in this very constrained 2-page tale is given to the foundational trauma. 5 of the 12 panels, or almost half of the story, given over to an event that takes just minutes, and then years pass between the panels on the 2nd page. Notice, too, the logic behind the choice of the Bat identity. The goal is to terrorize. The frightened and traumatized child now wants to be the agent of traumatizing fear. And one of the most interesting things about Batman's origin is the insistence with which it has been reiterated. No other superhero returns to his beginnings quite as repetitively or compulsively. In one of the most interesting early retellings, from 1948, the origin was represented in the context of a story in which Batman actually tracks down his father's killer, the amusingly named Joe Chill. The implication here is that the revenging spirit of Batman is born the very instant that the Waynes are killed. The gangster can see something terrifying already in the eyes of the surviving child. But although the adult Batman will track Joe down in this story, in the long term, no closure results. The origin would continue to be periodically revisited, and during the 1970s, the Joe Chill story was retconned out, doing away with even the pretense that closure might be achieved. Now, since the 1970s, references and allusions to Batman's origin only seem to have increased in number and intensity. In fact, almost every single story of stature about the character from the last few decades evokes it in some way. For example, Frank Miller includes the origin in both The Dark Knight Returns and Batman Year One. Fair enough, perhaps, since these stories serve as bookends to the imagined larger narrative of Batman's life. But it's less easy to account for Grant Morrison and Dave McKean's insertion of this flashback into Arkham Asylum, a story that is not particularly concerned with Batman's beginnings or possible endings, or Ed Brubaker's decision to include a retelling of the origin as part of a hallucination suffered by the hero in this Joker-centered story, The Man Who Laughs. And it was surely unnecessary for Jeff Loeb and Jim Lee to open their 2003 story, Hush, with a reminder of an origin that by now anyone buying the book surely knew. I mean, can you just imagine a reader picking this up, opening it and going, "Oh my God, they killed his parents?" It just seems unlikely. And in the 2004 graphic novel Broken City by Brian Azzarello and Eduardo Risso, the image of an orphaned boy with murdered parents appears again as a repetition with a difference, a shadow or doubling of the original shadow cast over Bruce Wayne's life. Same crime, new victim. But Azzarello and Risso weren't the first creators to try this variation. It's actually one of the oldest tricks in the Batman Bible, if you pause to consider that it's essentially Robin's origin story too. Robin, who is introduced for the first time in Detective Comics 38, is rendered an orphan by stooges of organized crime, making his story one of the first repetitions of the original Bat trauma to appear in the Bat myth, and also making Robin another shadow or double figure in this world that seems increasingly populated by shadows and double figures. What's more, when Robin's tale is retold in All-Star Batman and Robin, the connections to Batman's origin are emphasized. Instead of a trapeze accident, the Graysons are shot dead. The visual imagery here is clearly intended to recall the trauma that started it all. Now, Azzarello and Risso's repetition of the original trauma is therefore a repetition of a repetition. In fact, it is at least a repetition of a repetition of a repetition of the original trauma, since Batman has actually already witnessed this scene in Broken City in this story from 1974 by Steve Englehart and Vin and Sal Amendola. Now, this constant circulation around the point of origin simply does not occur in the case of Superman or Green Lantern or Iron Man or indeed almost any other superhero. Spider-Man is perhaps more origin-centered than most, but even he doesn't come close to Batman in terms of the sheer number of repetitions. Why should this be? To answer this question, I'm going to draw on the work of yet another psychoanalyst, the one with the biggest cigar and the longest shadow, Sigmund Freud. So I'll break off here and ask you to take a look at the Freud reading in the PDF, and I'll see you in the next video.